Coming up next, Missing 411 is is the general title of now what is a 3-volume set, investigatory work by former cop Dave Paulides, and it has created quite an outpouring of reaction from you coast-to-coast listeners, has sold a lot of copies. David is back now with Volume 3 that expands his investigation into these weird disappearances beyond the borders of the United States. We take our break and come right back with Dave Paulides here on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. Dave Paulides holds 2 degrees from the University of San Francisco, has a professional background including 20 years in law enforcement and senior executive positions in the technology sector. If you've been listening to the show for a while, you know of his interest in Bigfoot. He's one of the founders of the North America Bigfoot Search, has written 2 of what I consider to be the most credible books about the search for truth about Bigfoot. And that search led him to something entirely different, a different kind of mystery that is represented in now 3 volumes of his book, Missing 411, this latest one, North America Cases and Beyond. Dave, great to have you back on the show.
Hey, George, thanks for having me.
I don't want to dwell too much because I want to talk primarily about your book, but we have to talk about Bigfoot and the DNA study. I should remind our listeners that you were one of the instigators of this. You helped collect the samples. You went out and looked for somebody to conduct the DNA search. You and your partners settled on Melba Ketchum. Talk to me in general reaction about the study results and perhaps more importantly, the reaction of the Bigfoot community to the results, because it's been all over the map, but in particular it's been pretty harsh.
You know, it's a mixed bag, just like you said. I think that the people that are making derogatory comments, I would say probably 90% of them haven't read the study. And that's unfortunate. The study is sound. We got over 100 different samples. We were the group that brought in other groups to help us bring samples in from throughout North America. We had nuclear DNA and mitochondrial DNA that was accumulated. We had 3 different labs do the testing. It wasn't one lab. We had several PhDs write the paper. It wasn't one. We've had some comments from some people in the Bigfoot world that I was shocked that they would say something like they did. And I think that we've ruffled some feathers of many, many old-timers out there because they've lived in a world where Bigfoot was an ape. And for the people who don't understand this, there's really just 2 factions. You either believe it's a human-based creature or it's an ape or a gorilla. And if you look at all of the older researchers that have been around 40, 50 years, the centerpiece of their books is apes in the North or apes in North America, et cetera, et cetera. And just to bring some reality to this, there's never been any ape or gorilla bones, never any ape or gorilla hair ever found any time anywhere in North America in the wild. If you talk to any Native American group or First Nations group in Canada, they all believe Bigfoot, Sasquatch, is a human. Every tribe states it's a human. Many tribes in the Pacific Northwest that I've written about in the past say that they trade with them, that they communicate with them. This was written in newspapers in the Oregonian way back in the 20s and the 30s. Now, why these people seem to ignore all these facts, I have no idea. And when we first got into this realm of research, we didn't have a dog in the fight. We could have went any which direction. It was just to get to the truth. And part of that truth is accumulating DNA and having labs test it. I don't believe that they like the result. And unfortunately, many of the journals in the world seem to be less than honest. And what I mean by that is that the PhDs that wrote this paper, scientific white paper, submitted it. I was privy to the response from some of these journals. The questions that came back from them were embarrassing in the least and criminal in the most. And what I mean by that is that they asked absolutely stupid questions that were easily answered and completely addressed in the paper. It was as though they never read the papers, they never wanted to accept the paper, and they never really wanted to review the paper. So in Dr. Ketchum's defense and the rest of the PhDs, they never had a chance with many of these big journals.
Well, I don't want to say I told you so, but I should let the audience know that you were kind enough and Dr. Ketchum to share with me some of the initial results 2.5 years ago. And I was floored by the initial information that had come in, the initial analysis. But I suggested to you at the time that it would be pretty hard to get any journal to publish it, even though the work was done as legitimately as possible.
And, you know, that's probably the sobering reminder when you step into a world as a group of amateurs, as we are. We're not from the academic community, which is where most of these papers come from that journals review. And most of the people that sit on the board that review these papers are academic types as well. So maybe it's because we were outsiders, maybe because the findings completely fly in the face of what science may believe is the evolutionary path of a human. I don't know. But it's very disturbing.
Were you surprised by the results? I mean, you said, you know, you had an inkling that it was human. That's what the tribes had said all the way along. But when you finally saw the DNA results, were you floored?
I would say yes, because some of the DNA there isn't answered by going through GenBank. And normally, if we swab our mouse, you and me, we're going to see back thousands of years where we came from and our path. With this DNA, it's highly unusual. And I suppose that part of it was pretty surprising. But in general, you know, when you have dozens and dozens of tribes singing the same song and saying that they've dealt with these beings for hundreds of years, you know, that has to mean something.
You know, there's been a lot of nitpicking in the Bigfoot community about the study, a lot of it nitpicking about Dr. Melba Ketchum herself or things that she said, but I have yet to see any kind of a really solid scientific refutation of the results. I've seen some allegations that it must be contamination, but really there are answers to that, wouldn't you say?
I would think there would be, and as the people in this world know, there's a professor named Brian Sykes from Oxford that took on a study and said he was going to be out with his results around Christmas time. He didn't come out. But now that he has our results, and he probably understands the path that we took to get those results, I would presume that sometime in the next 4 to 6 months, either Sykes will never come out with his study on Bigfoot DNA, or it's going to come out and it's going to mimic what we have.
Well, if it mimics what you have, I mean, that's a heavyweight backing you up.
Absolutely.
Talk to me about, I'll ask one more question on this. Dr. Ketchum, we've had her on the program, and I appreciated her coming on to tell us about the work and to defend it. What's the relationship there now? Is it strained? Because I know you don't see eye to eye on everything, and I don't know if she's, if you are still on speaking terms or whether there's been harm caused to the overall cause by things that have been said. You want to tackle that or not?
Well, I'll say this, that we are the group that went out to find someone to do the study. And we went to 3 or 4 different academic institutions explaining that we have the specimens, we have the DNA, we need someone to do the genetics behind it. George, there wasn't one university that wanted to touch the topic. So we had to change path, and we had to find a lab that had the background and the expertise that was willing to take it on. And we weren't funded with a deep well of money. We were lightly funded, so we needed somebody to do this on almost a pro bono basis. And there were a few. Dr. Ketchum's a courtroom certified expert on genetic studies. She's qualified in the Texas courts many times. And she was one of those people that had an open mind about the topic. And we went with her, and she poured her heart into this, and she succeeded where other people have failed. And I think that some of those people in that genetic world that have made these comments have tried to get to the core of this DNA, and they weren't able to. And I will say that it was Melba's undying attempt to understand the secret behind that genetics that allowed her and her diligence to get to the point of finding it. So I will say I have the utmost respect for her for what she's done. And she has been, and before the study ever came out, we had talks, and I explained, hey, this is what's coming. I mean, the reason other scientific people don't want to come into this Bigfoot world is it's a world that's filled with hate. I mean, there's so many organizations and there's so many people that call themselves researchers and things that just want to belittle everybody. It's very easy to say something negative about someone, but it's very hard to say something positive. And that comes out in this world, and the attacks are endless. And when a scientific person or an academic person outside looks in, why would they ever want to take part in that? And Melba at least stepped into that world, and she did a stellar job. And for that, I respect her immensely.
Well, I'll tell you, I thought the UFO world was crazy, but it's been an eye-opener for me about the Bigfoot world. I mean, there are obviously some very well-intentioned folks who are curious and open-minded, but it seems like a lot of them are drowned out by people on the fringes who they're more interested in being right or being loud than they are in getting to the truth. I think the most interesting part of the study are the blind tests, is that you and you submit the samples to Dr. Ketchum. She gives them to these high-quality labs and doesn't tell them what they are. And then the labs discover it on their own, and they're kind of floored by the results, and they ask, what the heck is this? And then you have some of them, once they find out what you're up to, oh, you can't use our name. You can't publish these results, because that is so telling, I think.
It's amazing. You go into this thinking, well, scientists are into discovery. They want to find new things. They want to be challenged. They want to be that person on the paper that finds a new entity in the world. In reality, I think it's just the opposite when it comes to Bigfoot. And again, it goes back to that craziness factor. There's so much disturbance in the community that it almost seems to us as though it's a manipulated process just to make everybody think it is full of craziness.
Tell me this, one last question, then we move on. Where does the study go from here? Do you have something else in mind? Additional samples, additional tests?
Honestly, I've pulled back a lot from that Bigfoot world. Part of our edict as an organization was to prove at a scientific level that the biped exists, and I think we've done it. Whether anyone wants to admit it, whether anyone wants to read the study and take it to that next level, personally, I hope that another academic institution takes a look at this and says, you know what, there is something here. Let's engage. Let's get more specimens in. Let's write it at a different level. Who knows? I do know for a fact that there are 2 universities out there that are at least looking at it and have people in the field. So that's
good.
Promising.
That's good. Let's shift gears now. Another reason why you're pulling back from the Bigfoot world is because you've got a heck of a mystery on your hands with the missing 411 volumes. Volume 3 is out, North America and beyond. It's just as stunning as the first 2. I guess to begin with, maybe you can tell me, are a lot of these cases from your radio appearances, that people hear you talking about cases in various parts of the country, and then, hey, there was one like that here, let's send it to Dave?
Oh, absolutely. And I've got to thank the readers and your listeners for opening our eyes to things that we probably could have never found.
Did you suspect? I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's hard to go out and cover entire area of North America on an archival search. So when people call in or write in and say, hey, have you heard of this case? Have you heard of that case? It's great. We appreciate it.
Did you suspect all along that you were going to find cases outside of the U.S.?
We had a hunch at the beginning, but we weren't sure.
Let's start with, we're going to be taking a break here in about 4 minutes or so. Let's start with the basics to recap some of the basics, so that those who have not heard you previously understand about the kinds of disappearances we're talking about. First of all, the numbers, a general number that you know of so far. How many?
At least 600, 650 right now.
Most of them in national parks and national forests.
And open spaces in North America.
Tell me about the clusters.
So the first 2 books, we identified 28 clusters. We're up to, I think, 34 now. And those involved 3 or more people missing within geographical proximity to each other.
And how many clusters do you have?
I think we're up to 34, 35 right now in North America.
What would be the top one? Yosemite?
Easily.
How many cases there?
There's got to be at least 25.
I remember my first reaction when you told me the general topic, and I thought to myself, well, gosh, yeah, people disappear in the wilderness, in parks, in forests. They get lost, they fall off a cliff, they get eaten by bears. What's so unusual about that? Walk us through some of the steps about the kind of characteristics that separate these cases from just a normal kind of a disappearance.
So any type of disappearance which is related to water, and the water's suspect in the disappearance, meaning a drowning, they got taken downstream, those are not in the study. Any type of suicidal tendency is not in the study. If there's any type of obvious criminal conduct, meaning that the case is classified as a possible homicide, that's not in it. Any type of animal attack is not in the study. And how do we know about animal attacks? Search and rescue people, they're professionals. They know what to look for in these things. They're not in the study. It takes after reading thousands of missing persons cases, certain elements start to come out at you, and they hit you in the face. Time after time, you read the same thing, and you start to say, how could this be? It's almost like it's a mimic of the other four cases in the same state. And as an example, in Pennsylvania between like 1930 and 1950, there were more kids missing in that state during that time than anywhere I've ever seen in North America. And it's not even close. And I wrote about that in the Eastern book. So, and the disappearances in those areas almost mimic each other. Many of them involve small children at a farm or in a forest. They disappear. Most times they're never found. A lot of times the people disappear with a canine. Many times if they disappear overnight, bad weather comes into the area, rain, snow, etc. If people are found, many times they're found in a creek bed or riverbed. Other times, if they're found, they're missing clothing or shoes. If they're found, an older person, they can't or they don't want to remember what happened. Other times, it's a disabled person to the point where they can't speak, so they can't communicate what happened. Or it's a very young child, and they can't speak at all. Berries, swamps, and boulder fields are three of the predominant things that keep coming up with missing people from the East Coast and the West Coast. And again, it's that clustering aspect. If you went up through the middle of Northern California all the way to the Canadian border, that route of the Cascades has more people missing under unusual circumstances than I can ever tell you. And it has more clusters of missing people up through that area than any place else I can imagine. So those are some of the few.
There are other ones that really jump out at you. The fact that, that they are the ones that are found, either bodies or found alive, are found in areas that have been searched repeatedly. In your book, you mentioned one case where the searchers had walked right over that spot 50 times or more and not found them. It's as if they're taken somewhere and then redeposited. Or little children who are found miles and miles away, impossible distances, walking uphill. Talk about that for a moment. Well, I tell you what, we're going to take a break here in about 30 seconds, so maybe we save that. How many cases do you mention in the new volume? How many are new?
I think there's about 200 in there.
And what are talk to me about how many countries you now cover.
Well, we included stories from 5 countries, predominantly Australia, England, Indonesia, Iceland, and France.
And the Canadian, you knew there were going to be Canadian cases. Did you know there would be this many?
Well, if you look at the topography of North America, you kind of imagine that if there is some type of criminal activity or there's some kind of consistency in disappearance, it's not going to stop at the border. So we kind of presume that it would be happening up north.
When we come back, Dave Paulides, I want to get into some of the other characteristics that make these cases less than prosaic, and then we'll get into specifics, case by case, state by state, country by country. Missing 411 with Dave Paulides coming up after this on Coast to Coast AM. We're talking with Dave Paulides, back to talk about Volume 3 of his monumental work, Missing 411. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of really interesting cases in this new volume, but one really jumped out at me. It's the story of, we'll call him John Doe, that's the reference in the book, a young child who went missing, then was found alive. And what's most striking about this story is his description to his mother and father about who he encountered during that time when he was missing. It'll chill you to the bone. We'll get into that in just a couple of minutes here on Coast to Coast AM. Dave, I want to spend a few more minutes sort of recapping for those who have heard this before and don't remember it, and for those who haven't heard it, why these cases are so weird. There are a couple of characteristics that really jump out at you. One is about where the kids, particularly kids, how far away they're found. Talk about that.
That's one of the most unusual aspects to this. And when we first got into this, we read just about every search and rescue manual you could find. And when professionals go out into the field, they set up grid patterns to search for people. And it's based upon the topography you're in, based upon the age and the health of the person you're searching for. And for a child, say, under 8 years old, they're usually found within 2 miles 90% of the time, usually within the first 4 to 6 hours. Well, in the Western book that I wrote, I described a kid named David Allen Scott who was 2 years old. And I usually stop at this point when I'm talking to an audience, and I say, how many people in the room have children? And I say, think back to when your child was 2 years old. How far could that child walk without dropping from exhaustion? And how fast could they move? How quickly could they get out of your sight? Well, David was with his family vacationing at a place called Mono Village, kind of on the eastern side of the Sierras down near a city called Bishop. And he disappeared from his family as he was down near a lake, and everyone initially thought he went into the lake. Make a long story short, they searched everywhere. They finally brought in some soldiers, and for some reason they started going uphill. And they didn't go a little uphill. They went way uphill. And when you look at the valley that David disappeared in, there's a trail that almost goes straight uphill in a zigzag fashion up this mountain. They went over the top of that mountain, down into another valley, back up another mountain, total 3,000 feet, and they found him deceased behind a boulder. They tried to interview the soldier that found him, and they asked him if he had any injuries, and the soldier said no comment. I thought that was interesting. But one of the stories in the new book involves a boy named Clarence Murphy, and he was vacationing in the Central Sierras in a place called Camp Sacramento, which is at about 6,000 feet. It's a place where families go to take their kids. It's right next to the American River.
Yeah, that's a weird case. That's a spooky one.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And Clarence was vacationing with his mom. He was in a sandbox at the camp, and his mom just stepped away for a couple minutes. And she came back, and he wasn't in the sandbox. And they had a conversation, and he said he would stay there. And they searched. Initially, all the searchers usually go to the river, or they go to the lake, and they search hard there, and that's usually where kids ended up dying and being found. But in the cases here, that's not where they're found. That's not where they go. And Clarence did the same thing that David did. And whether it was against his will or with his will or whatever, he went uphill again. And I can tell you, as an adult, when you're at 6,000 feet and you have a choice between going uphill or downhill, you're going to go downhill because it takes the wind out of you at that elevation. And initially, they searched for 2 weeks. They never found him. And they searched hard. They pulled out everything they could to find this boy. Well, fast forward from April 14th, 41, 14 months later to September 22nd, 42, there was a deer hunter that was up a ridgeline 2,000 feet uphill, 2 miles from where Clarence disappeared, and he saw a shoe on the ground, and a little child's shoe, and he knew that somebody had disappeared in that area before. And he went and got a sheriff, and they started searching, and they found little tiny bits of bones, and they didn't find a full skeleton. The coroner made a determination based on a tooth that they found that it was Clarence, and they made a determination that he died of exposure and exhaustion, which is just ridiculous because there's no way they could have known.
No.
But he was in an area that would remind you a lot of Yosemite because there's a place there called Lover's Leap. I've been in this area many times. It's filled with just huge pieces of granite boulder fields. It's a hell-forsaken place, great place for deer hunting. And this hunter was on his horse, and I think that's probably the only reason he was there because it's so rugged.
You have cases of where little kids, 5 or younger, disappear into thin air, and they're found hours later, miles away, right? 8, 9, 10 miles or further in wilderness.
Yes. Yeah, there's a story out of Oregon where a boy disappeared, and he was found 12 miles away, 11 hours after he disappeared, over 2 mountain ranges, over 2 or 3 different creeks and rivers, and he had to have gone through fence lines. He was found unconscious the next morning in a creek bed by a search group. But what is more interesting to that case, and there are many others like this, is that why would searchers be in that location? It makes no sense at all. There's no way in the world a search group would be that far from the scene unless they had some other kind of information.
I mean, it's as if these kids, in the case of children, are picked up and transported somehow far away. They couldn't possibly walk that far under their own power.
I don't believe they do. I mean, I have 2 kids, and everybody I talk to about this says, no, there's no way that could happen. And to your point earlier on about where kids are found, many times they're found on the main trail the searchers are using, and they're found unconscious, sometimes laying on the trail, laying on a boulder next to a trail, but they're in a place that it would be impossible to miss them when you go out that next morning. It's almost like they're put there to view or to find, because they weren't there every day that the searchers went out.
Another weird aspect is the inability of dogs to follow a scent. I think that was true in the Clarence case in that Camp Sacramento.
Absolutely. They brought up multiple canines. In fact, in every story in my books, the canines fail to pick up a scent that eventually finds the victim. Sometimes they go a ways down the trail, and then they lay down and they don't want to search, or there's no more scent. This past summer, I was asked to talk at the largest group of search and rescue professionals in the world in Lake Tahoe. It's called NASR, National Association of Search and Rescue Professionals. I gave them the 50 cents edition because I only had an hour in front of them, but I gave them the outline of what we're doing and what the canines do. There was a line out the door of these guys wanting to talk about the same things that they'd experienced, but they thought they were just so isolated and unique. And I've been around canines before in the police department when we searched, and these dogs just live for the search. For a search dog to just lay down at that time or not want to track, these searchers that had the canines, they said it's one of two things. Either there's no scent there, or it's extreme fear on the dog's side for some reason that we can't comprehend.
Another aspect that's pretty weird is the people just basically vanish into thin air. You got kids who are out in the yard playing, their parents are 10 or 20 yards away, and boom, they're gone in an instant. Or adults who are hiking with a group, they're the last one on the line, boom, they're gone in an instant. Talk about that for a moment.
Well, there's an interesting case in this new book about that exact incident, and it involves a boy named Jamie Bordenkircher, 2 years old, disappeared June 12, 1965 from the North Shore of Lake Tahoe. And right away, for the people that know that area, this isn't down in the populated area by the lake. His family had a summer home up above Kings Beach on kind of an isolated road, almost to the back of the wilderness, just almost less than a mile from the Nevada border. And Jamie's parents lived in Butte County up in Northern California. They drove down. They parked their car in front of the vacation home. There's no other cabins around, and there's a swing set in front of their house. Well, the family's going in, unloading their things, and Jamie gets out, and his brother says he goes to the swing set, and he gets on the swing. So his brother goes in and is in the house less than 5 minutes, comes back out. The swing is still swinging, and Jamie's gone and nowhere to be seen. And the family got frantic, looked everywhere, found nothing. Huge search that went on for weeks. And for some reason, the canines on this one kept going downhill to the water of the lake. And for the people who don't know this area, it's pretty steep walk downhill. You cross the road that perimeters the lake, and there's a lot of homes down there. And it's a very, very busy highway that crosses that area. So they brought in the Coast Guard. They brought in everybody. They searched everywhere. They didn't find anything. And the interesting aspect to this case is if you go northeast from there, there's a couple of disappearances in an area called Slide Mountain, a ski resort near Incline Village and on the Nevada side. And there's also a disappearance of a girl back in the 1940s from an area that borders Reno and that Slide Mountain area that's in this book. So this is a 4-person child cluster area that's evolving just in the last 6 months.
One other weird aspect is what happens to clothes, in particular to shoes.
That is highly, highly unusual, and it's initially something that we were told, well, it could deal with hypothermia, except the issue with this is that it happens so quickly that hypothermia can't be setting in when these kids take their clothes off. In many of the cases, it could be within 200 yards of the point where they were last seen, the clothes are off and they're gone. Sometimes the clothes are found and the shoes are found. Sometimes no clothes and no shoes are found. In many of the cases, the kids are found and they're almost naked, or they're found sitting down in a thicket without any clothes on and without any shoes on. And what we're always wanting to know is what's the condition of their feet. But obviously in the articles that are older, etc., they're not going to have these kind of notations. But if the child walked 2 to 4 miles through the woods without shoes, they're going to have some injuries on their feet. If there's no injuries on their feet, they were carried there.
I know in the previous volumes you had instances where clothes were found folded up or laid out as if in a ritualistic fashion. And I know in the new book you've got a case, I'm trying to remember what it was, but it's an elderly lady who was found wearing different clothes from when she disappeared.
Yeah, that's an interesting case from Central California. A woman disappeared she's a very wealthy lady. She disappeared from her kind of a rural ranch. And there was a lot of suspicion that the family was involved, and a lot of inner griping going on and finger pointing, etc. But they didn't find her for months and months. And then somebody said that they thought this lady picking berries off a berry bush in this remote location near Lake Berryessa. And she was eventually found wearing overalls, like men's overalls, and shoes, and she was found dead. But where she was for the previous 2 months, how she survived, where she got the clothes, there were a million unanswered questions with that case, but in many ways it mimicked other elements that we see in these cases, so that's why it was included.
I would like you to address for a moment the questions that are buzzing through people's heads. That is, why isn't it a bear or a mountain lion? Why couldn't it be drug smugglers or hermits or mountain men living out there that are abducting people and taking them away somewhere?
And those are the first places everybody goes when they first hear me speak. And I like to say that when we're speaking here on the phone, you're hearing probably less than 1% of the entire story. And so I really don't want anyone to go any place in their mind that can reconcile these thoughts, because once you read the books, I've yet to find anybody that'll say, hey, this is just bogus. Everyone reads these, and they will see that there's a commonality here of elements in each of the cases. Now, one of the things about animal attacks is that if somebody is attacked, usually you have time to scream. You have time to make noise. And if it's an adult, you're usually going to fight for your life. And that fight is going to result in a huge disturbance on the ground, hair, blood, tissue, etc. There's going to be almost like a major crime scene. And dogs and canines are easily going to pick up that scent and track that down. The reality is that in all of these cases, animal attacks have been excluded. And they haven't been excluded by me. They've been excluded by search and rescue or by the law enforcement agency that's doing the case.
Same thing for people, say drug smugglers out in the national forests. I mean, dogs could follow that scent as well if they were responsible.
Oh, for sure. And, the last thing that somebody who has a meth lab or somebody who's growing weed, the last thing they want to do is do something that's going to bring any law enforcement to the scene. They don't want to cause any disturbance. They don't want to do anything that's going to bring any awareness to what's going on there. Think about that. And if it's an adult and they're going to try to take you, where are you going to go? And it goes back to, well, the canine's going to be able to track you as well. And it's going to be able to track scent. And if you have a meth lab or you have a drug marijuana grow there, the flyovers they're just going to be in the area to such an immense degree. They're going to find it, and it's going to be revealed. The idea that somebody's in the woods abducting people has been brought up in the past, and I don't want to point this at the National Park System because it's an unfair allegation, but I will just say it, is that some people have heard me talk on the radio and say, well, maybe there's a serial killer that's moving around park to park and killing people. The reality is when you read these stories, it's essentially going to be an impossibility based on the facts in the stories.
It's a serial killer who doesn't leave tracks, doesn't leave a scent, has never been caught, leaves no clues.
Exactly. Well said.
In your new book, I mean, the new volume, a lot of the law enforcement folks go as far as to say, we don't think this is a normal disappearance. This was a kidnapping of some sort. They don't take it as far as you do because they don't have the database you do, but they think it was a kidnapping just because of the circumstances that you're describing.
Well, even going back to the Bordenkircher case in North Lake Tahoe, it had been 40, 50 years now since Jamie disappeared. In 2007, his mother gave an interview, and in it she said, well, originally I think everyone tried to get me to believe that he drowned in the water. The more I look at it is I believe he was abducted. And when you look at the cases in their totality and you start to read the opinions of law enforcement and adults involved, loved ones, you will see the word abduction in there many, many, many times.
Boy, and it has to be frustrating for these lawmen to be out there often with so many resources, with hundreds of people searching, to go through an area almost arm in arm and not be able to find something, and then have the body or the missing person appear in an area that they'd walked over 40, 50 or more times.
And I think the public sometimes gets numb to disappearances, especially children. When a child disappears in the wilderness, the forest, or on a farm or a ranch, the idea that they're not going to be found should not be really in our vocabulary. And when you talk to searchers, they're going to tell you, we're going to stay until we find that kid. And most of the searchers, probably 95, 98% of them, are volunteers. And when I was in Lake Tahoe, that's what it was. There were all these people here voluntarily spending their own money and their own time to get trained, and they have a passion for doing it. And kids that disappear can't go that far. They can't travel that fast. And if you start to think about those two criteria and usually the number of resources that are at people's disposal, meaning you're going to put helicopters and planes in the air with FLIR, forward-looking infrared radar, to see a heat signature on the ground, well, son of a gun, in all of these cases, FLIR fails. Yet there are so many cases where children disappear and FLIR works.
Dave, when we come, we're going to take a break here. I want to talk more about the use of FLIR, and I want to, when we come back, get into this case of John Doe, because in some cases, kids are found alive, and the stories they tell are pretty chilling. Much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. We are rocking and rolling with my guest, Dave Paulides, who the third volume of his book, Missing 411, is out, and it's incredible, it's chilling, it's spooky, scary. If you are familiar with the first two volumes, or you've heard our interviews with Dave, you know that in many of these cases, most of these cases, in fact, the people who are found, they're either not found or they come back and they're unable to explain where they've been. They're either stunned, a lot of them have handicaps, they can't speak, or they're too young to express where they've been. But in a handful of cases, the people who are found alive, youngsters in many cases, are able to give clues to where they've been. And some of those clues are just astounding, jaw-dropping. We're going to get into one of those, the case of John Doe, where he was and what he remembers from the time when he was missing, right after this on Coast to Coast AM. Dave Paulides, the new book, Missing 411, North America and Beyond, looks at new clusters, also has fresh cases from clusters you've talked about before. I seem to recall that you did talk about Mount Shasta cases before, but this new one, this John Doe case, missing child, 3 years old, is a jaw-dropper. Tell us the story.
Well, it's interesting because I actually heard of this case years ago when it was evolving. And the reason being, this is one of those strange coincidences, is that John Doe disappeared along a creek river that I used to fish as a kid. And I'd probably been there at least 50 times. And the area is world-class fly fishing, very, very thick woods. There's a couple real famous Hollywood types that own hundreds of acres in the area. It's just pristine wilderness, great fishing. What happened was he was there with his family, and happened on October 1st, 2010. About 6:30 p.m. he disappeared. And one of the things that I didn't state earlier on is that late afternoon, early evening is the prime time for a disappearance. Anytime between, let's say, 2:30 and 6:30 or 7 at night is the time that these things seem to happen. This area of this disappearance has a very long history of strange things. I mean, people have said that there are people called Lemurians that live beneath Mount Shasta. There's been a history of Bigfoot sightings in this area. There's been tons of UFOs flying around Shasta. And I've written about a cluster in my past Western book about Shasta specifically, a cluster of disappearances. Well, this boy's 3 years old. He disappears from his parents. They immediately call the sheriff. A big search starts. And they don't find him. I mean, they looked everywhere. this area doesn't have a lot of low ground coverage. It's a lot of big trees with a lot of open area underneath. But near the rivers and things and some of the trails, there is some shrubbery, but not a lot. So anyhow, we fast forward 5 hours. At about 11:30 at night, they find this boy sitting in the middle of a bush in a thicket, and he doesn't say anything. He's taken home. Parents talk to him. He's in sort of a stunned disbelief. So finally, the next day, they get talking to him, and they said, well, explain what happened. And he goes, I really don't know. He says, I just kind of disappeared. And, well, where were you? And he tells this story that he is taken into a cave, and he thinks it's underground. And he says, I know it's dark outside, but when I'm in this cave, I could see the entrance, and it's light outside. And he says that he's with a woman that looks exactly like his grandma. And originally, he thought it was his grandma. But then he said that in the cave, there's a lot of other things that look like people, but they're all robots, and they're not moving. And he says after a while, he figures out that this woman really isn't his grandma, even though she's really nice to him and very polite, but he believes she's a robot as well.
She's got sparks around her head or something like that?
Yeah, he made some kind of comment about, there was some kind of light or sparks or unusual light coming from her head. And then he says that she was real nice until she started to get pushy, and she took out some sticky paper and laid it on the ground and told him he had to poop on it. And he told her that he didn't have to go, and she got mad. And he says, now, as I'm sitting there, he says, they asked him, what else did you see there? And he said he saw a lot of small guns and things around the outside perimeter of the cave, and they all had a lot of dust on them. So then you kind of fast forward a little bit, and the boy went to go spend time at that grandmother's house the following weekend. And he tells the story to the grandmother. Well, the grandmother then told us that 3 weeks before the boy disappeared, the grandmother and her husband were at that exact river spending the night. And they actually woke up in the middle of the night because the grandmother felt a pain at the base of her neck, and she had her husband look, and there was a small bloody spot at the base of the neck. And she says, I don't know if it's related, but I just wanted to tell you that I thought that was strange. I happened to be there where this point he disappeared, and he sees a grandmother, and I have this bloody spot on my neck. I don't know what to think of it. Make a long story short, the boy's fine. He's developing fine. He hasn't disappeared anymore. But that is probably the most unusual story that I've ever heard about a small boy disappearing.
Yeah, it's like Granny had a DNA sample taken from her when she was there before. I mean, I don't know if we get too weird about it, but that's what it sounds like.
That's what we thought.
How many other cases, for those who haven't heard your previous interviews, how many other cases do you have where children are able to come back, they're alive, and they're able to give some kind of clue about where they've been? I know you don't have any exactly like that, but you do have some other versions of pretty weird tales.
It's very, very unusual. There are a very small group of cases where a child comes back or they're found and they tell unusual stories. There's some from the East Coast where the person says, I saw this giant thing standing behind a tree, and it was kind of swaying back and forth, and then I don't really remember much, and then you kind of found me. Other times there's a story out of, I think it was Arizona, where three kids disappeared from a picnic ground, and they were gone for a day and a half, and when the searchers finally found them, they walked up on them, and the kids immediately went down and were hiding. Searchers walked up to him and said, what are you doing? Why are you hiding? And he says, we thought you might have been the 8 people again.
Wasn't there a girl who talked about a story about a talking dog?
Yes, and that's... You really don't know what to make about some of these stories because they're so outlandish that you don't know what to believe.
In the UFO world, you have what's known as screen memories, or people who claim they've been abducted. And I know you don't want to veer into that, but they claim to have had some sort of an abduction, and a screen memory is implanted into their head that what they saw wasn't an alien, it was a big-eyed owl, that sort of thing. It's almost like an implanted memory in some of these kids' stories.
Well, one thing I tell people that are in the Bigfoot world, and I tell law enforcement people who I talk to today, is that I think one thing that's unique about our group is that we read everything we can get our hands on related to something like this. And there was a guy named John Mack who wrote a book about UFO abductees. And you read about the circumstances and what they find out from the individual during hypnosis. And we've always thought that it'd be fascinating if we could get some of these people at a conference room and have them go through hypnosis. And I think the similarities between them and them knowing that there's other people just like them out there, it would be fascinating.
No, but you haven't done that. You have never had a regression?
You know, I haven't. And the reason for that is that when I first got into this, a group of missing organizations had heard what we were doing. And two of them got a hold of me, and they're really nice people. And they said, just be careful, Dave. And when you make that approach on somebody who has gone through an incident like that, they can easily take what you're doing the wrong way, and that you're trying to profit from their loss and from their injury, and a lot of people don't want to be talked to. So kind of the stance that we've taken is that if people want to talk to us, absolutely, we're going to open up and do everything we can. On a few cases, like the Dennis Martin disappearance at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, we did approach his dad, and we got a lengthy interview out of that. But we're very careful about that.
Yeah, I can understand that. Maybe what you need is somebody who was abducted as a child who's alive now, hearing this for the first time, and needs to come forward and try to retrieve the memories of what really happened to him. So
right.
If that's the case, folks, give us a call. Let's go to talk about some of the new clusters that you discuss in this Volume 3. Mount Rainier National Park. I mean, these are as good as stories as you've had in any of the books, and I think our listeners up in Washington State are going to be pretty spooked by it. Go ahead and tell us a few of these tales.
Well, I think one of the best ones, and we got, through a Freedom of Information Act request, we got the case file on this person, and his name was Joseph Wood, Jr., 34 years old. Disappeared July 8th, 1999. This person is unusual, and in the thousands of cases we've reviewed, this is only the second black man that I've ever written about that's disappeared under the criteria we've set down. Joseph was a super, super smart guy, Yale graduate, Eagle Scout. He was an editor for a New York newspaper. Then he moved on and was a publishing editor at a publishing company. And he was in Seattle for a conference. And during one of the days, they had a break, and so he decided to go to Mount Rainier and do some bird watching. He was an outdoor enthusiast and a bird enthusiast. And he went to a place called Longmire Parking Lot, parked his rental car on a beautiful day, and sat down on a very, very large trail and started to hike up. And it was a nice day. There was still some snow on the ground. And as he's walking up the trail, he comes across another bird watcher. And they stop and they talk to each other, and they have a great conversation. They kind of compare notes. This guy says, this is how far you can go up the trail, and then there's going to be too much snow. And it wasn't that much further. And Joe said, good. And they separated. He walked further up. That was the last time he was ever seen. And again, an established trail in good weather, in the middle of the week, broad daylight, disappeared. Huge search. What I tell people about Joseph is that not only was he a brilliant guy, but he was also an Eagle Scout. And I think that's the first Eagle Scout I've ever written about as well. And Eagle Scouts are trained in the outdoors. They have to do good in their lessons, otherwise they never reach that rank. And you have to have a certain amount of common sense to reach that level as well. And that area of Mount Rainier that he disappeared in isn't one of the most rugged areas of the mountain. It's a pretty mundane area. And searchers were able to track down that witness he saw, and he said there was nothing unusual. It was a great conversation. He was upbeat. We talked about the birds, etc. So anyhow, after about a 10-day search, the Park Service was ready to call it off, and his family and a newspaper in New York called The Village Voice wrote an article about it, his disappearance. And again, just like we've talked about earlier, abduction comes into the scenario. And abduction comes in because searchers and family members have a difficult time reconciling what happens to these people. If somebody disappears, chances are they're going to start dropping things when they get stressed. So in Joe's case, he might drop his book, he might drop his map, he might drop a backpack, whatever he's carrying. In these instances, they find nothing. It's so strange. And in Joe's case, they never found anything. They never found his body. They never found his coat, books, maps, nothing. And so a very, very unusual case. But as we sort of suspected about Rainier years ago, the more we got into it, the more strangeness went into it. And when you talk about the abduction scenario, you don't really think about abductions on the side of the mountain or abductions when people are hiking. You tend to think of abductions around parking lots maybe, or around populated areas near a lodge. But on a trail where there's only 2 cars in the parking lot, Joe's and the guy he saw on the trail, the idea that an abduction is going to occur there, almost unheard of. And how that could have been accomplished, that's $1 million question. And it wouldn't have been in a time of the year when weed was growing up on the mountain. That wouldn't have been it. And guaranteed there wouldn't be anybody with a meth lab on the side of the mountain because it's normally way, way too cold. So it's a big, giant whodunit. And
you had another disappearance on Mount Rainier, a little girl. This was a long time ago, not as recent as the Joseph Wood case, but a little girl, 4-year-old girl, who was found alive.
Yeah, and there are so many of those little kids, say under the age of 6 or 7, that vanish in that exact scenario, that it's actually on our end, it gets to be, you get to be numb to it. But the reality of it is, when she disappeared, she shouldn't have disappeared. She was in close proximity to her parents, and she's found again uphill from where she was lost. But and her name was Marcella Remisky back in 1950. She was 4 years old. But I like to talk about things that are really, really abnormal. And there was a guy named Eric Lewis. I don't know if you remember that one. It disappeared in July of 2010. 57 years old, absolutely phenomenal shape, climbed as a career all over the world, and was climbing with some super experienced climbers on the side of Rainier. And they were doing some technical climbing high up. They were pulling each other up, and Eric was on the other end. And all of a sudden, the line kind of goes loose. So they pull it up, and the carabiner at the other end is there, but there's no rope attached to it. So they decide they'll go down, and because they're yelling for him, and they're not getting anything, and they can't see him. And we're talking about nothing unusual here. They're climbing the mountain. A guy's attached to the line. He's over the side of the cliff. He didn't fall. There's no screaming or yelling. There's nothing. They looked for him. They called in the National Park climbing team. This guy was never found. And he was attached, and they were starting to pull. The rope went limp. The carabiner's attached to the other end. Eric's gone and never seen again.
You say in the book that he was among the top 1% climbers in the world?
Per the National Park Service climbers that were there. They said he knew that mountain better than most of the professionals that climb it.
He would have had to have disconnected the rope himself on purpose, almost.
Yeah, exactly. It didn't break because it was never attached, and they said it made absolutely no sense.
I don't want to backtrack too much, but I wanted to just to mention that one of the reasons I brought up the case of Marcella, that 4-year-old girl we were talking about a moment ago, is when she was found alive. We had talked about clothing that was weird. Her dress was on backwards, and there was something weird about the laces of her shoes.
Exactly. And her mother made that observation and said, she doesn't even know how to dress herself that way. And she doesn't know how to tie her shoes. And they were tied in a way that she had never seen. The entire thing didn't make sense, but it did make some sense when you look at the clothing and the shoe issue that we've seen on many other cases. They're off or they're gone.
It's almost like some of these crazy abduction encounters that people report is that it's almost made to look ridiculous on purpose.
Yeah.
So that no one will believe it.
Right.
We're going to take a break in about a minute, but I wanted to let's go to the other side of the country, the Adirondacks in New York. You mentioned that as a new cluster area that you focus on in the book. How many cases, first of all?
I think in total there's at least 8, maybe 9, because there were some in the Eastern book that first came out, namely a small boy named Douglas Legg who disappeared, and tracking dogs did track him all the way around Lake Placid and back down the other side. And I don't know if people remember that he disappeared on some family acreage and completely under someone's watchful eye. The boy was never seen again, and the area he would have had to gone through in the high peaks of New York, a normal man couldn't have made it. And yet tracking dogs not only went north, they went north way up over the top of some of these mountains and then back down around the other side of Lake Placid, and then he was lost in the middle of a swamp. That really started us to pay attention to the Adirondacks and what was happening there.
We'll come back to the Adirondacks. There's a case of a guy named Steve Thomas that I want to talk about. Then we'll talk about some foreign country cases as well. Much more to come with Dave Paulides, author of Missing 411. We're talking with Dave Paulides, author of Missing 411, now out with Volume 3. When we come back, we talk about the Adirondacks, maybe pop over to Florida and talk about some cases there, the Sequoia National Park, and then some foreign countries as well. Much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. Dave Paulides will get back to cases, specifically the Adirondacks, in a moment. One thing we haven't touched on, and I want to at least cover it briefly, is the lack of cooperation from government agencies. That's another really interesting aspect of this whole mystery, is that the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, those agencies that you would think would want to keep a list of missing persons just to figure out how many people might be vanishing from within their purview. They don't keep a list like that, and they certainly are not very cooperative when it comes to sharing records, are they?
No, they're not. And I think the audience needs to understand that why we went after the National Park Service from the very beginning is because they're one of the few groups that has a large law enforcement contingency that patrols wooded areas, namely national parks. And they have a law enforcement group that's federally trained, probably better trained than most small law enforcement agencies in the U.S. And they go to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. They're dedicated law enforcement people. They don't pick up garbage. They don't clean campsites. They don't do those kind of things. They are true professionals, and they're assigned to the parks for patrol. And a subcategory of that is they have special agents that are the detectives in the parks that do the follow-up on criminal activity and missing people. And when things get really complicated, they call in the FBI, and the FBI will take the case. So we knew that these people had been trained at the highest level in law enforcement. They know the needs for documentation. They write quality reports. I've read hundreds of them. And these people are professionals. So when we first asked them for a list of missing people from their park system, and they stated that they didn't have any lists, we thought it had to be in the writing we were doing and the semantics of it. And we resubmitted again, and they said, no, we don't have these lists. We don't keep track of missing people. And I tell the audience, and when I'm speaking, is that you look at any website from any medium-sized to large police department in the nation, and on that website there's going to be a section about missing people in that jurisdiction. A lot of sheriff's office carry those information. Interesting part is you won't find that anywhere in the national parks. And when you dig a little deeper, they tell you that, no, we don't keep track of missing people inside of our parks. And when you ask them why, they say initially, well, we don't have the wherewithal to keep that information, but we're planning a computer system in the future that's going to be able to do that, and we will have that. And that's what we were told 4 years ago. They still don't have it.
I mean, come on, how hard is that?
Exactly, George. Now, what I do tell, and I actually put a poster up on the wall when I'm giving a talk, and I say, this isn't rocket science, people. With a piece of binder paper and a clipboard, and you divide that binder paper into name, date of disappearance, location, and the final disposition, and there is your tracking mechanism for almost every park in the nation. And this isn't hard to do. Now, one of the guys on our team has been head of one of the bigger law enforcement agencies in the U.S., and when he was told that the park system wanted to charge us $1.4 million for them to establish a list of missing people in their system and $34,000 for a list of missing people from Yosemite, he said, Dave, guys, you got to think about this. If they want to charge you that much money and they want to take the heat for not maintaining a list, as that is absolutely politically incorrect, that heat must be a lot less than they'd take if they did release all that information to you.
Well, for example, Yosemite, you say that is probably the number one cluster in the country. Let's say there's 24, 3 dozen cases of missing people. It's probably a lot more, but that you've been able to dig up the records about. How hard is that to maintain a list of a couple dozen names?
It doesn't make, I mean, we try to rationalize it here. It makes no sense at all. I mean, we could talk about thousands of law enforcement agencies in North America and Canada where you know and I know that missing people are something that everybody tracks, everybody understands, everybody can go to a site and they can pick it up. National Park System doesn't.
It's like the mayor in Jaws doesn't want people to stop going in the water.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
I noticed in the new volume that you make a distinction that I think is important because it further complicates things, and that is that people are missing persons for a while, and then the search ends and they give up and they're legally dead, so they're taken off a missing persons list. So it really it distorts the true picture of how many people are actually missing.
And that's a very confusing aspect to this entire situation. The National Park Service has a classification called missing presumed dead and no longer missing. Now, there are cases out there where, say, an adult disappears and the family has to get them to declare dead to get the benefits.
Right.
So they go to court, they get a judge to say, okay, we're going to classify him as deceased. He's been gone for a year. All of a sudden, he's not on any records anymore either. Now, as more time goes by, it's harder and harder to find those files if there's nobody looking for you anymore.
Basically, you've been able to find the files because you go to newspapers, databases, online records, things of that sort, but not through any cooperation of the government.
It's very hard. I will say this about the National Park Service. When you take them by the hand and you walk them to the case and you give them the case name, the location, the time, all of a sudden they can usually I say, find that case. There's a series of cases out of Crater Lake National Park, and I was told that from, say, 1978 and 1992, all the cases were thrown away because they didn't have any place to keep them. And I think in the day of microfiche and things that's highly suspect, but that's what they said. There's a case right now of a girl that disappeared about 2 months ago in the Grand Canyon, in Grand Canyon National Park. This girl was actually from Colorado. She was on a month-long trip with a group floating down the river. They stopped at an area where a small creek comes into the Colorado. They were camping. In the middle of the night, the girl disappeared. The case is classified as a missing persons case, and they all stated at the beginning, her body will come up. She just fell in during the middle of the night. Well, other people have said, no, this girl's done this many, many times. She's a seasoned camper. She knows where the river is in the middle of the night. If she had to go to the bathroom, she knows where to walk. Something else happened. Well, it's one of those really unusual cases. I have contacted the Park Service twice now, and twice I've been refused. And what they said is that the case is still in process and they're still investigating. Again, I go back to them and I say, is it a straight missing persons case? They say yes, but they're still not releasing the case yet. It's one of those unusual things that happens every once in a while.
Let's jump forward. I mentioned about Steve Thomas. This is a guy who went hiking with 5 of his friends in the Adirondacks, northern New York, and vanished. What's unusual about that case? This is from 1976.
This is one of those really fascinating cases where all of these guys were outdoors people. They were on a break from a community college, Onondaga Community College. Steve was 19 years old, and they were on the side of a mountain called Mount Marcy, and they had stopped at a place called Hopkins Lean-To to kind of spend the night, put up their tents, and have fun. And it was the 5 buddies and their dog. And as they're getting all their things together to camp out for the night, Steve says, hey, I'm just going to walk up this trail a little more. I'll be right back. I'm just going to get my legs going again. And he walked out of sight wearing a yellow rain slicker. And it was the last time anybody ever saw him. He was in a good state of mind. He was having fun. Nothing strange, unusual to him physically or mentally. He didn't have any disabilities. At about 10 p.m., they started to get really nervous because bad weather was coming into the area, wind, rain, and some light snow. The guys got out, walked up the trail a little bit, yelling for him, screaming for him, looking for him, nothing. They came back into their tent, and as they originally tried to leave, they tried to bring the dog with them, and the dog wouldn't leave the tent. And when they came back to the tent, the dog was whining and would not move from the inside of the tent. Now, flash forward a few weeks, Steve had a brother named Bob Thomas, and Bob actually committed his life to trying to find Steve. And the rangers in that area said, Bob Thomas knows Mount Marcy better than anybody. And the following summer, after Steve disappeared, Bob and his dog were out searching, and they actually found the body of another climber named Buddy Atkinson. And his dog started to dig through the snow, and they found this guy who'd been dead for a couple years. That's how thorough Bob and the search group was in looking for Steve. Steve's never been found. He's one of a group of people in this area of the Adirondacks that disappears, is missing, you find nothing. One thing about this case that we haven't talked about before, that is bright-colored clothing. And I've written about that in the other books, and there seems to be a correlation to people who wear bright colors and they disappear.
Yeah, that's a pretty weird aspect. Let's jump to, I promised that we'd talk a little bit about foreign countries. Canada, you've got some amazing cases all the way across from British Columbia to Nova Scotia. Which of the Canadian cases do you think are best exemplify this mystery and jump out at you?
You know, there's a case out of the western area of Canada involving a lady that was a lookout tower fire spotter, and her last name was Stewart, Stephanie Stewart. She was an older lady. She was in her 70s. She'd been doing the job for decades, and she was in the tower. This is an isolated road up and down to it. I wrote about in the Western book, and in the middle of the night, she disappeared. And somebody came up to see her, and she was gone. And Stephanie, again, was an older person in good health, but she wasn't the type of person that could really or would really get out and start moving around. She had water on the stove. What was missing were the most unusual things: her blanket and her alarm clock in her room. And some people may say, well, you know, a rogue killer drove up that road, kidnapped her, and took her. But from a law enforcement perspective, that would be the last thing that a serial killer or a murderer would do. Because this road going up there is like 6 or 7 miles long. It's a dirt road, one way up, one way down. If you're a killer, you don't want to be taking a road like that because there's too much of a chance someone's going to see you and spot you and identify you. And it just doesn't make sense. They searched for her for days, and they never found anything. All of a sudden after that, the Canadian Natural Resources Group started to change the way they did things with lookout people. And, you know, we started to look at lookout towers in the United States as well, and there's a lot of weird things that have happened around those towers at night and during the day that I can't say are directly related to Stephanie's disappearance, but they go to show that there's a lot of unusual events that happen around them.
What is the level of cooperation that you get from Canadian authorities, or have you even tried to see if they have records? Do they keep records about disappearances in parks, for example?
That's a great question, and they have something very similar to our Freedom of Information Act, but they only respond to Canadian citizens. Luckily, I got a couple of buddies that are Canadians, and they do the dirty work for us, and phenomenally, they don't carry those records either.
Let's jump to Australia, down under. What made you suspect that would be a place where this kind of activity takes place? And give me a representative case from down under.
Well, you know, Australia in some ways is a lot like the U.S. They have topography that's really different. And right away, when the first books came out, there was a lot of interest from Australian residents. And I got a lot of emails and things. And probably got sent maybe 50 cases, and 48 out of the 50 didn't qualify and didn't meet the criteria. There were a couple that did. One involved a boy who was climbing a mountain, and on this mountain there's a lake that's within sight and not that far away. He goes on his cell phone and he calls and he says, I need some assistance, and it isn't real clear what's wrong, but he's on this mountain, and then the phone goes dead. And searchers go out and they search the mountain, and they don't find anything. And days, weeks go by. They find this guy on the side of the mountain in a boulder area, deceased. And he had water with him when he made the climb. He didn't have water with him at the time. And they stated that he died of exposure and dehydration. And honest to gosh, at the bottom of this mountain, probably less than a quarter of a mile away, is the biggest lake in the world in this part of the country. It doesn't make any sense at all. He was in perfect health. It's a very, very strange case that nobody that was sending me this information believed the facts about it.
I know I'm jumping all over the world here, but trying to cover some ground. I can't think of two countries more different than Iceland and Indonesia. The one thing they have in common, they both start with I, but you've got cases from both of those countries. Do you want to touch on either of those?
I'll tell you about the Iceland case, and that's not necessarily a missing persons case. It's a societal belief that I was told about and I looked into, and there's a phenomenal concurrent element there between us and Iceland. That being is that I've stated in many of the books that there is correlation between people disappearing around boulders, in boulder fields, etc., and I couldn't put my finger on it. Somebody sends me a story that people in Iceland believe that spirits live in boulders. And these spirits come out of the boulders and they do things. Meaning that, let's say you lived in an isolated area and you kept your hammer out, they would take the hammer and they would move it, or they would take tools and they'd disappear. Sometimes if you disturbed them the wrong way, they might do bad things. Well, I looked into it, and there's a group that actually made a movie about this, and it's on YouTube. I name it in the book. I could never even pronounce it, but the Icelandic people believe in these spirits so much that when they build roads, they don't displace large boulders. They'll make the road go around them, even if they could be moved. In some cities, the boulders have names and addresses. It's phenomenally. I read this. I couldn't believe it because it fits in with people disappearing around boulders. Doesn't make sense. There's not that many places you can go. Yet these people have known about these spirits that come out and do strange things, mischievous things, and sometimes bad things, and they've had this belief system for hundreds of years.
I know it seems people can cross that off and say, oh, it's just folklore, but as Jacques Vallée has written about folklore in connection with UFO cases and beings, fairies, trolls, leprechauns, things of that sort, the modern equivalent, they become aliens, and is there a connection, is there something comparable, say, in the Indonesian disappearances?
Well, again, we go back to the bright colors. I was on a show with Whitley Strieber, and Whitley had read my books. In fact, Whitley writes the back cover for my current book. But he said, Dave, I read your book, and I immediately thought about cases in Indonesia where people had disappeared. And the villages in this area always tell people not to go into the woods wearing bright colors, otherwise you're going to be taken. And it turns out that there was a guy from Europe that was living in this Sulawesi village who validated everything that Whitley was saying, and that there's been a whole string of people that have disappeared, and they didn't know about, there were visitors and things, they didn't know about this bright-colored abduction scenario that is related. It was very strange.
You're very careful to not jump to conclusions. Your conclusions in this new book is like 1 page long, but I'm going to press you a little bit when we come back to see if your thinking has evolved on this at all. And we'll be opening up the phone lines. A lot of you have been on the phones ever since Dave Paulides came on the air tonight, so we'll get to your calls coming up here soon on Coast to Coast AM. We're talking about a dark topic tonight with Dave Paulides, my guest. I remember after his first appearance to talk about Volume 1 of Missing 411, I wanted to sort of put it to a test. Would government agencies give me the same response they gave to him? And sure enough, when we filed Freedom of Information request with the National Park Service and U.S. Forest Service here in Nevada to check out missing persons lists, we found out that those agencies don't maintain such lists here, and we're not all that cooperative about the cases that we knew to exist. When we come back, I have one more question for Dave about what it might be. We've heard a lot about what it isn't. I don't think he's going to give us a solid answer, but we'll give it a try, and then we'll open up the phone lines with your questions. Much more to come on Coast to Coast AM. Dave, we talked a lot tonight about what it isn't. And as in previous appearances when you've been on the show, what it isn't. Are you any closer to saying what it is? I mean, at a minimum, I guess you can say these aren't just disappearances, that people seem to be taken by something or someone, and not only taken, but transported somehow. I mean, that's basic, right?
So, not in my words. I'll leave it in the words of the parents and in the words of law enforcement. the vast majority of the time they go back to abduction. My child was abducted. And in this latest edition, I write about it because there's a section where there are multiple disappearances in a small confined area, meaning two people disappear in close geographical proximity to one another. This happened in the 1950s in Yosemite. Two students at the University of California at Berkeley, grad school students, they didn't know each other. They weren't taking the same classes, and they didn't live in the same building. One disappeared, I think it was in June, during summer vacation. Another one disappeared 3 months later. The guys didn't know each other. The parents didn't know each other. They were both camping in the valley, and they both went for short walks. After the second one disappeared, the families found each other because they were both demanding more searches. They want the Park Service to expend more resources, et cetera, et cetera. Both parents finally got together, and they wrote a letter to President Eisenhower, and they asked for special warfare troops to come into the park and search. In their words, they felt that their kids had been abducted. And therein lies the continual theme in these, that people understand their kids, they understand the situation, they understand the psychological aspect of their family members, and law enforcement and them come to this determination more often than you would ever believe.
That still doesn't tell us what it is, but you're reluctant to point a finger.
I will say this, because a lot of people point the finger at me and they say, I got an email about 6 months ago, you know exactly what's taking these people, and you're doing a disservice to society by not naming it. So let's go back 4 years when we first started this. I might have thought it was A back then. In the last 4 years, I've got no less than 10 emails that are like doctorate dissertations. That's how long they are. Very well thought out, very sincere. They give a multitude of things I know nothing about. I'll just name one, reptilians. I know nothing about this. I've never met anyone that saw one, but I have no less than probably 50 emails of people saying this is what's taking people.
You also hear stories that must be like flying dinosaurs, something from the sky.
Well, there's a story in this book, I'm sure you read it, in Nevada, where a boy supposedly walked up into an area where an Indian tracker was on a ledge. It's like a 400-foot cliff, and he crawled, and he should have fallen, and they ended up finding this boy in like a crow's nest in the middle of nowhere off a cliff on an isolated mountain in the middle of Nevada. It makes no sense at all.
I mean, it could be that this is a mystery that's not solvable, or if it is solvable, it's not an answer we're going to want to hear.
There you go.
That's small consolation or comfort to the families of those who are still missing.
I will. One more story for you is in the Western book. There's a story about a guy named Alfred Beilhartz. In 1938, he was visiting Rocky Mountain National Park with his family. They were walking about 35 feet above a river, and they said that their boy was right behind him. He was 5 years old. They turn around, he's gone. Call a Park Service. Immediately, they get approval from the Department of Fish and Game to block the river. That's the place everyone always goes. They went to the river. They didn't find him. And there's pictures in the book of this river, and there's probably 500 guys searching this river in a 1 mile stretch. They searched everywhere. They didn't find him. As the search is going on, 3,000 feet further up into the park and up in elevation, there's a husband and wife that are coming out of the high mountains, and they're sitting and they're resting, and they hear something 300 feet above them. And they get out their binoculars, and they look, and they see this little boy sitting on a ledge in this cliffy area, and they can't believe what they're looking at. And they're saying, what parent would let their child do this? This is insane. And anyhow, they don't know a kid's missing or anything, and they hike down, finally get into the basin, and they see thousands of people milling around. They still don't think anything. They drive down into Denver. Next day in the paper is Alfred's picture. And they say, oh, my gosh, this is the boy we saw up on the cliff. They drive back to the park. They tell the park people. Park people don't believe them. They split them up, and they actually think that they played some part in the abduction, and they're interviewing them. And they tell the same story. And they say, well, that's impossible. A kid could not get into that area. It's going to take us sending 20 guys up there with ropes, pitons, carabiners, because it's so difficult terrain. And plus, you know what it's called? Devil's Nest.
Huh.
Needless to say, they send a whole group of rangers up there. They search for 2 days. They didn't find anything.
Never did? No.
Never was found.
I'll touch on one more thing, and I promise I'll go to the phone lines. I think that the case that jumps out at me from the last time you were on the program is the case where it's a disappearance, a very strange disappearance for multiple reasons, and then these families see Green Berets that suddenly appear in the area as if searching for something. I was hoping that after we broadcast that maybe somebody who had been in the service and might have been part of that mission might have come forward. Any further developments on that? And would you like to just briefly recap that part of the story?
Actually, there's two cases in the eastern U.S. where Green Berets were brought in. And that was the Dennis Martin disappearance in Great Smoky Mountain National Park, and it was a Douglas Lake disappearance in the Adirondacks of New York. In the Great Smoky Mountains, Dennis disappeared essentially almost in the presence of his dad, his grandfather, and his brother. They were playing hide and seek on Spence Field up in the middle of nowhere. You have to hike into this area. Dennis disappeared. There was a huge, huge search, and unbeknownst to anybody is that the Green Berets fly in. There's been some talk amongst some news services that they were training nearby and happened to come in. Well, if that's true, I can't find any evidence of that anywhere. And in fact, the National Park Service didn't know why they came in. And to add mystery to that, when the Green Berets flew in by helicopter and landed, they established their own command post with communication center and told the Park Service they didn't want any assistance, meaning that they didn't want to work with anybody who knew the park, they didn't want to partner with anybody inside the park, and they didn't talk to anybody about what they were doing other than they said they were looking for Dennis. Well, they were there for a number of days. Nobody ever knows what their assignment was. I filed a Freedom of Information Act against the Army asking for orders on what their mission was inside the park. Not only didn't get a denial, I didn't even get a response on two separate FOIAs I filed. They never even sent anything back, nothing. So yes, the Green Berets coming in is unusual, and last time I was on the show, I asked if there were ever any Green Berets listening to call me because I'd like to understand it. Since that time, I've gotten 2 emails from family members of Green Berets. Green Berets wouldn't talk because they sign a secrecy oath, and that's the reason that's unusual. Normally, National Guards people from a community come in because they're in the community, and they come in and assist on a search. Green Berets sign a secrecy oath. They don't talk about their missions. Well, this is holding true because both families who contacted me said that their parents, their brother, etc., was a Green Beret, and that, quote-unquote, both emails almost said the same thing. Green Berets don't search for missing people.
Well, okay, that solves it. We're going to go to the phone lines now. A lot of folks have been holding on, and the phone lines are full. East of the Rockies, Allison in Portland, Maine. Hi, Allison. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. Boy, your shows with Mr. Paulides tonight and last year, and that Zodiac show, they're really creepy, and I just love it. Last year. Anyway, you brought up Australia, and I know this is probably long before the sort of time frame you're working with, but there's the very famous case there almost a century ago now of the picnic at Hanging Rock at the Ayers Rock in Australia, where a group of squirrel girls vanished. It was made into a book by Joan Lindsay and a film in the 70s by Peter Weir, a really excellent movie. And I think in the film, at least, one of the teachers that somehow came back or something. I don't know how accurate that was or not, but to this day, it was never quite explained. Do you know about that case and things?
I've heard of it, but we really don't know much about it.
No, I know. It just seems like a really strange one, and so it shows that these things have been going on. If they have been going on for a long, long time, most likely,
Ayers Rock is a strange place too. Sorry we couldn't answer your question, Allison. West of the Rockies, Jeff in Culver City. Good morning, Jeff.
Yeah, how you doing, George and Mr. Paulides? Welcome back. Yes, I often wondered about all those missing people who have just disappeared without a trace around the world, especially little children. For example, the little girl Maddie McCann vanished in Portugal, has never been found, yet on a few television news programs, they showed age-enhanced pictures of how she might look now as a teenager. It's very strange that she was chosen out of all these other kids that are missing, but it seems, Mr. Paulides, that someone somewhere is behind these numerous abductions, and when they show news programs like that, it's almost as if they're testing the public to try and see who's paying attention to what's happening or who can remember this kind of stuff. My question is this, Mr. Paulides, do you believe these abductions could be part of some type of Nazi-like master breeding program, or if there are alien abductions being conducted, do you think the various governments know about these abductions and are incapable of doing anything about it, so they just keep quiet? And I'll take the answer off there.
Thanks, Jeff.
So that's a good question in the sense that, do I think the government knows about it? I believe in one of my past appearances I spoke about the FBI being on scene on many of these missing kids cases and not taking an active role, but just quote-unquote monitoring the case. And if you look at the FBI website, they have a special section for unusual disappearances of children. Now, that's not a crime, but that's an FBI criteria and one of the reasons that they'll come in to investigate. And I find that highly unusual because the FBI was established to really investigate criminal activity. And now they're also investigating unusual disappearances. I've stated in the past, because I have friends that are agents, these guys are phenomenal at documenting things and phenomenal profilers. When I was a policeman, we would get profiling reports on what we're looking for. And I'm telling you, when we finally found the criminal, it was exactly what the profilers wrote. They were great at what they did. Now, going back to all the cases that we've documented where the FBI was on scene monitoring the case, I know that they were writing reports. And as I've stated before, these guys are really smart people. If we are smart enough to figure out that there's common elements that run through these cases, you know the FBI knows as well. I could guarantee it. They have put these pieces together much better, much faster than we have at the present time. Now, I'll go back to the Dennis Martin disappearance where the Green Berets were there. There was actually an agent on that scene. The same agent was on scene for many of the disappearances in those mountains during those time frames. As a very, very weird circumstance, I was interviewing Mr. Martin, and one of the last things I always ask anybody is I say, is there anything else about this case that wasn't made public that I should know about? Or is there something missing in the documentation that I haven't talked to you about? And one of the things that Mr. Martin told me is that, well, Dave, the agent on this case committed suicide.
Huh.
And we did validate that he did.
It makes you wonder whether a FOIA works with the FBI. I mean, it's tough. I've done it on other subjects, and you got to really tailor the request to get specifically what you want. So I'm not sure. You've probably tried, haven't you, Dave?
Oh, we have tried many, many times. And in the rare instances where we get a report, it's almost worthless because it's redacted so much.
First-time caller Thomas in Waco, Texas. Welcome to the show, Thomas.
Hey, real quick, August 16th, 1942, the L8 blimp, which is now the Goodyear blimp down in Carson, went out on patrol without its crew, was armed with machine gun and a radio, went out. The wind blew it back into the base. Crew's never been found, and there was no sign of any foul play on the blimp or anything. That's documented on the web. Two, the previous caller talked about the children. There's an astronomical amount of children that disappear every year. Also, the Ortega Highway down in Costa Mesa, people disappear out of there every year. And also, Paul, I sent you an email. I was living in Phoenix for 7 years, since 1999 to 2006. I'm an aerospace engineer, and one day I was in my backyard. From Tucson to Chandler, there was almost 40 helicopters in single file that came up to Chandler, made a left turn, and went to Phoenix. I'm assuming they were going to Luke Air Force Base. Nothing on the news. Absolutely nothing on the major helicopter military convoy, and I've never seen anything like it in my life.
Well, you're saying that's somehow related to the missing people?
No, but I've never seen, to his previous, Dave had a previous show about helicopters and stuff and things, and nothing about military activity, nothing, nothing recorded, nothing on the news, major military movement of helicopters, and I've never seen anything like that and never made the news. Complete blackout.
All right, Thomas, let's see if we can get Dave to react to this. Dave, I don't know if you're familiar with the blimp case he's talking about a crew that disappears from a blimp. And, I've got cases here in Nevada that we've talked about on this program about the old guy who was driving up north on Highway 80 and vanished. I guess if you really wanted to expand your parameters to include strange disappearances, vanishing into thin air, you could have a heck of a lot more cases, but there has to be a limit at some point.
Yeah, and we're trying to keep this really tight with the elements that we have. Boy, I'll tell you, we've had missing people, families contact us about their kids, and it's hard to turn people away, especially when they're missing loved ones. But we got to keep that tight, because if we go outside the bounds of that, then we're stepping into areas where we really may not understand what's happening, whereas we're getting closer to understanding this.
But you're not quite there.
No, I'm not.
Any plans for another edition of this book? I mean, I think you could probably go on forever, couldn't you?
This week, I was sitting in the office of a very rural county sheriff in Colorado, and there's a couple of disappearances in his county, and we were sitting around talking, and I was explaining the things in the book, and his eyes lit up, and he says, he goes, I've always thought that these disappearances up here don't make sense. He goes, I don't have the manpower to commit to really do a thorough investigation. But he says, when you show me a map of Colorado, and I start to see that there is some consistency amongst, in the northern part of the state, there's 3 boys that have disappeared in 65 years, and there's not another boy that fits that criteria for the whole state. He goes, what am I supposed to think? He goes, you're the first group that's ever put this together in a way where we can sit there and understand it. He goes, something is going on. We need some help with this.
Well, that's another aspect we haven't even touched on tonight, but we've talked about briefly in the past, is that in these clusters, they seem to come in groups, like young boys in one cluster, older people in another cluster, adults, and that just is another weird aspect of this that's hard to explain. We're going to go to wild card lines, all of them full. When we come back, our conversation with Dave Paulides continues right after this on Coast to Coast AM. All right, here we go to the wild card lines. Tony in Illinois, thanks for being so patient. What's on your mind?
Thanks a lot, George. This is absolute synchronicity. Dave Paulides, absolutely great work. I'm definitely going to look into this book. This is a guarantee for me. I was 9 years old, actually 8, going on 9.
Hey, Tony, I got to tell you, your phone is really breaking up, so you're going to have to jump into this real quick because you're making an awful noise on our end here.
My dad was building a house in Piedmont, Missouri. I was 8 years old. I saw a snake. I was at a distance from it. It backed into its hole. The next thing I know, I was completely displaced. It took me 2 hours to find my way back home just from my dad working with a hammer. But it completely displaced me from a pond to a complete part of the forest of Piedmont, Missouri. Absolutely strange. When I got back, my dad said that that's not the only thing strange that happened if you got lost, because when he was hammering out on his house, some giant shadow went over his house. And, when he looked up, he didn't see anything. He thought he was going to see a bird. He did not see anything.
Hey, Tony, I'm sorry to cut you off, but the sound from your phone on this end is really terrible. But I'm telling you that you have a great story here to tell, and I'd like to hear more of it. If you could try to call back, or if you can contact Dave, I think he'd like to hear your story in great detail. We'll provide information. If you'll hang on for a second, we'll give you a link where you can get a hold of him. But I'm sorry that we have a problem with your phone. I know you've been holding on a long time. We're going to go to Andy in Los Angeles on the wild card line. Hi, Andy.
Hi, George. You're a great interviewer. I really enjoy you. And Dave, you are also a great guest. I have a quick comment, and then I'll bring up a few quick points, and you can feel free to comment on any point that you think is of significance. It's very unusual to me that, and I don't believe in coincidences either, that the government would not keep records or leave a paper trail. And secondly, because if the public is not aware, they will not be able to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Secondly, if you can comment on one or more of these points that I'll make rapid fire here. Was there any one or two colors that seemed to stand out in the abductions? Number two, an entire village in China, in a mountain village, disappeared in the last 5 to 10 years, and it's on the internet. Men, women, and kids all gone. Number three, has anyone checked into the possible, in the cluster areas of the GPS coordinates, approximate coordinates, if there's a pattern there? Also, have
hey,
any
Andy,
warning?
Andy, that's all you get. We got a whole bunch of people, so 3 questions is all you get, but thanks for calling. Dave, did you write those down? What colors to begin with?
No specific colors, just bright colors in general, yellows, oranges, things like that. GPS coordinates, I can tell you that we put the disappearances on a map, and that's how based on the last location the person was seen, and that's how we determined the location for us.
The other question was about China, some disappearance of an entire village. Does that ring a bell?
No, it doesn't.
Okay, Andy, thanks for the call. Appreciate it. Dale in Kansas City, Missouri. Good morning.
Hello, George, and hello, Dave. A quick comment and then a question, and then I'll hang up. I grew up in St. Clair County, Alabama, in an area called Ball Rock. And growing up there, me and another neighbor friend went up on Ball Rock because you could get there by road. He points out to me a cave. We ascend down in this cave, and I get scared and come out of it because we have no flashlight or anything. Next thing, has there been any cases reported in Alabama? I know Mount Cheehaw is the highest point, 2,407 feet, but have there been any missing cases in Alabama? Thank you for taking my call.
Okay, Dale. Any come to mind?
None come to mind, but I do know that there were some in Alabama. In the Eastern book, we documented it. I don't recollect. I mean, there's 600 cases that come to mind. George, one thing, I did get a question on my end as well. It said, have any military personnel vanished during training exercises? None that I know of in North America, but I doubt that they had released that information. And then one other thing is that we have always looked for someone who is a remote viewer who's retired from the military. We would like to use them. And that question has come up many times. And if we don't know how to find one, but if somebody is listening out there and wants to work with us, we would like to work with them.
I'll help you find one. In fact, I'll help you find a group of them. We can talk about that off the air. Dale, thanks for the call. Joe in Washington on the wild card line. Good morning, Joe.
How you doing, George? It's an honor to talk to you. Another great show.
Thank you.
Mr. Paulides, I really appreciate your tenacity in this subject. I think you do a great job with it.
Thanks.
Quick story. We got a call one day that of a missing person, so we went out to lend a hand. We probably sent 5 officers and horses, and there was sheriff's department there. There's probably 60 people total. And we were looking for about a 6-year-old girl that had walked to a small creek from a campground with her cousin, probably 50 yards from the campground. And her cousin went back to the campground, and this little girl disappeared. So we looked for 2 days. She was wearing a pair of flip-flops, a pair of shorts, and a tank top. And temperature was probably 65 degrees during the day and got down to 30, 32 at night. And we searched for 2 days. We had 2 Air Force helicopters with their FLIR units at night flying. We had a law enforcement helicopter flying, and the search went on 24 hours a day. Well, about 2 days later, this little girl just walked out to the road, probably less than a half a mile from where she disappeared, and looked like nothing had happened. I mean, she spent 2 days or 2 nights in the woods, and she came out looking like nothing had happened. She was in great shape. She was, my question is, how many kids do you think that disappear like this? That to me, it was extremely strange. We couldn't believe that we found her. We couldn't believe that she was that close, and we couldn't believe that she was in that good a shape.
Wow.
But how many kids do you think just disappear and then are found a day or 2 later, and it's never reported as like a missing person?
Many. In fact, that scenario you just explained has happened many times. And the issue with that is that the victim isn't debriefed many times and questioned. Everyone's happy that she's found, but nobody wants to take the time at that point to really sit down with her, debrief her, and find out how this thing evolved.
Well, her family are Native Americans, and she didn't. Her parents didn't want anything to do with talking to anybody. Once we found her, they were gathered up and they were pretty much gone. But so there was no debrief in this one for sure.
Yeah, that's unfortunate, but that's the norm as well.
It's as if people are happy. Look, we're glad that the kid's alive and been through this ordeal. We're not going to bother her anymore, right?
And that she is Native American puts that much of an unusual twist on it, because I am somebody that knows a lot about Native American history and Native American lore and their myths and legends, and that just brings that much more question to my mind right away.
Joe, appreciate that call. I hope you'll be in contact with Dave, and maybe you guys can swap some notes on that case. If it's not in Dave's database, it's one that maybe needs to be there. Appreciate the call. Wildcard line, Athena in Durango, Colorado. Good morning, Athena.
Hi, George. Hi, Dave. There seems to be a very peculiar pattern to these abductions. Number one, the people that are taken are spying on nature. The people in the watchtowers, the guy bird watching, or they're conquering nature. They're trying to climb a mountain, hiking, etc. And, nature doesn't deal a lot with technology. Maybe nature is trying to find out how to use technology against us the way we use technology against them. You'll notice that when the children are taken, they leave behind all the technological things, the clothes. And the children are usually found because children are not so technologically advanced. They probably wouldn't need as much information. But the adults don't seem to be found as much. And when they are found, they're dead. Like maybe their technology information has been sucked out of them, talking about those spirits that came out of the boulders, come at night, and how nature is angry at us about our technology. You hear that all the time. Maybe they are really angry, and they're tired of being spied on and not getting any feedback for what they're giving us.
Well, that's an interesting perspective. Dave, any thoughts?
Not really, no.
It's interesting speculation. It's not something you could prove one way or another, but it's as interesting an idea as we've heard. Thanks, Athena.
We're using technology.
Yeah, we got you. Understand. I wish we could prove it one way or another. Thanks for the call. East of the Rockies, Mike in West Palm Beach. Hi, Mike.
Yeah, how you doing? I want to tell your listeners the Bermuda Triangle is live and well. I live in West Palm Beach, which is at the apex of the triangle. And if you go to Google, look up the following: Florida, missing or disappearing swimmers. Every so often a person drowns, of course, a tourist. They find the bodies later. Two recent cases got the attention of the press, though. One was a Israeli millionaire disappeared off his yacht, who was parked right near Fort Lauderdale. Never found his body. Then there was another one a few months ago that really got people where I live upset. There was a girl who was going out in the water, got caught in a riptide, and was screaming for help. A man jumps in front of dozens of witnesses, saves the girl, and he disappears. They never found his body. That really got the press's attention. Another issue was this. Every few weeks, an empty boat comes ashore here. And these are from illegal immigrants. And the assumption is they come in the beach and they run inland. But the problem is nowhere for them to go. Because these are condos on the beach. Rush Limbaugh lives here. You got tremendous police patrols. They never report what happened to these people. All they report is these boats keep coming in every few weeks. They're empty, and there's no one around. And there's another issue, too. But I live with the Bermuda Triangle. The press doesn't mention anything. They don't give follow-up stories about these boats and what's going on.
Okay, Mike, we're going to give Dave a chance to talk about that. Dave, you mentioned earlier you try to weed out cases involving water, I guess, because you have to draw a limit somewhere, but that's pretty interesting stuff.
He brought up an interesting point that I've never talked about publicly, but about 3 weeks ago I got a letter from a man in Finland who had gotten my books, and he'd done some research on his own, and that in my missing East and West books, he found that on one day where two kids disappeared, a plane disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle, and then he found that another plane disappeared in Lake Erie or Lake Michigan that was a Navy plane, and that was in correlation to one of the disappearances in one of the books.
Appreciate the call, Mike. West of the Rockies, Reba in Washington, which, as we learn in this new volume of Missing 411, is a hotbed of these kinds of cases. Reba?
Yes, hello there. I have three areas that I'm kind of curious about. I do rock hounding. And I'd like to know if there have been any of these disappearances around the Lolo Pass, Montana area, or the Red Top Mountain area northeast of Cle Elum, Washington, or the Colville National Forest.
So I would say that anywhere in that Washington Cascade corridor, there's been disappearances, unusual disappearances. And so I would say, as I've told everyone that I speak in front of, that I wouldn't hike alone, number one. I wouldn't go into the woods without a firearm, and I wouldn't go into the woods without a personal locator beacon. I've never taken a case where somebody's disappeared that was armed and had a locator beacon. There's been people that have disappeared under the criteria that have been armed, and there's been one person that disappeared under the criteria that had a locator beacon, never with both.
She also asked about.
I'm going to take that under advice.
She asked about Montana, Dave. I know you do have a section in the new book that talks about cases from Montana.
Yes, and it's lengthy, and there's a lengthy section in the Western book as well. I mean, when you have 600 cases, I just can't remember them all.
Sure, I understand. First-time caller, Alan in Texas. Hi, Alan. Welcome to the show.
Hey, George. How are you?
Okay.
Yeah, one afternoon I left out of Reno, Nevada, heading towards Portland, Oregon, and I'm a truck driver, and I was bobtail. And the weather seemed to deteriorate, and I was on California 89 and stopped at a rest area and went to bed on Friday afternoon, Saturday early morning. And I have a computer in the truck that tracks my movement and time, and it showed that I had stopped Saturday and didn't wake up until Tuesday morning when somebody knocked on the truck. And I don't know if I was taken or lost of time. If does that seem to happen sometimes too?
Are there, Dave, among your cases, people who just basically go to sleep and then wake up days later and that's all they remember?
That sounds more like something John Mack had written about in his book, but the consistent element there is that the people just don't have a recollection of what occurred.
Yeah, missing time type case. Thanks, Alan. Sorry we can't give you more info. There's a caller named Leon in Washington who says he's got a case involving a disappearance of a military personnel, but I'm sorry that we're not going to have time to get to it. Leon, I hope you will go ahead and contact Dave to share your information with him. And I'm sorry that you're on the phone, but we're less than a minute away here, so we're not going to have time to deal with it. Dave, where do you go from here? What's your next step in collecting information about this mystery?
I think we're still making small steps here. I think we'll probably hear a lot more from your audience and from around the world about other cases. And honestly, I think it's starting to come down, and we're going to refine it a little more. And I think the clusters explain it a little better, and hopefully we'll come to some resolution in the next couple of years.
We need some pressure on the government, too, to start keeping a list, or if such a list exists in secrecy, to make it public.
Yes, that would be nice.
Yeah, have you ever tried talking to members of Congress or your own congressman?
When we've been refused FOIA requests before, I've gone to a